Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with us today Dr. Stefanie K Johnson. She's an associate professor of management at Colorado University's Boulder Leeds School of Business, where she studies the intersection of leadership and diversity. And she's also a member of the MG 100 Coaches, was selected to be part of the 2020 Thinkers50 Radar List. And you probably know her from her work on her best-selling national book, Inclusify, Harnessing the Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams. Dr. Johnson, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode.
So, Dr. Johnson, for people who don't know about you and your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a college professor at the University of Colorado, and I study really leadership is what I'm interested in. And to me, in this time, I think leadership has to be inclusive leadership, so leading everyone equally and effectively. And so that's really what Inclusify is about, is just tips and tricks that leaders can use to be more inclusive for their teams. Because I think, at least in my experience, leaders want to be inclusive. Like if you ask people, do you want all the ideas on the table? Do you want individuals to feel safe sharing their perspective? Everyone's like, yes, I do. And we don't always know how to make that happen. And so that's where Inclusify comes in, and this work around like, what is it that the best leaders do to create inclusive teams where everyone feels like they belong and is engaged, and the result is better innovation and performance.
So just so that we're all using the same terminology, when you're talking about inclusivity and including people, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I use the word inclusion to mean an environment where people feel like they belong, that they're accepted and valued, and they can still belong while being their unique and authentic self. And so it's based on this theory called optimal distinctiveness theory. And the idea is that one of the most basic and essential human needs is to belong. And at the same time, we want to be distinct, but we want to be unique, right? We're all different. We have different identities. And so we want to be unique, but only to an optimal level that we can still feel like we belong. And that's, I guess, maybe your question is rooted in the idea that I think the words diversity and inclusion are often used interchangeably. Like diversity is, do we have different people in the room, right? Like demographically diverse. And inclusion is, do those people feel like they can fully participate? I think it's not, we can have inclusive leadership without a diverse team, but I don't really think that's inclusion. In some ways, I had a PhD student who said that's actually like exclusion, right? Like I have a very inclusive, homogenous team, but we've left out anyone who's different. It doesn't really seem like you get to call that inclusive.
I like this idea of optimal, what's it called? Optimal differentiation.
Optimal distinctiveness theory. I want to be distinct.
Distinctiveness theory, yeah. Because I think a lot of people who consider themselves creative, they take a lot of pride in their distinction and being a bit different. But a lot of people who don't consider themselves creative often want to be as close to the standard and the status quo as possible. What do you see as being the impacts there of getting these two different types of people working effectively together?
Right. Yeah. So it's the idea of like, I want to stand out, but I also want to fit in. Right. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the creative people are more likely to want to stand out. I think they don't want to stand out more. It's just maybe in more visible ways. But I think everyone wants to have a unique identity, right? It just may show up more for really creative people who share their uniqueness more outwardly, or maybe who find belonging in a place among similar uniqueness. And I think what's interesting is some of the companies that really did this the best, that I studied, were ones who built in that difference as part of the culture. So, we want everyone to bring their difference to work, and so that we can all be different together, and yet we still belong because we're united over the fact that we are unique and distinct. I think Zappos gets a lot of credit for this kind of idea of, they celebrate weird, like people being different, even in a corporate environment.
Now, we talked a little bit before the recording started. You said that some of the insights in this book and also your general work at the university, it's coming from research. What sort of things are you actually researching, and how do you see that translating into leadership and the working environment?
Yeah, so I study leadership, and using multiple methods, like we do experiments where we manipulate things to look at the effects. We do a lot of correlational studies, big companies where we collect data and try to infer causality, even though it's through correlational data, maybe over time or something like that. And then interviews with people to add color, some more qualitative research. And that's a lot of what's in Inclusify, these interviews with Fortune 500 CEOs and how they created inclusive environments that drove innovation in companies like PayPal and Salesforce that are extremely innovative, but also really find inclusion to be key to their success in that regard. As for things I'm doing research on now, I think like everything needs to be redone when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice kind of research, because I think they've just undergone this dramatic shift. And, even if just the differences that we're experiencing in the workplace due to COVID and like people working remotely and things like that, I think it's a real opportunity to retest some of our kind of research assumptions of things that we believe to be true, but maybe aren't true anymore about the way people want to work, want to be included, or how we view women or women of color in the workplace. There's just been I don't know about you, but my world has changed a lot over the last 20 months.
Absolutely. I think that the world's changed a lot over the last 20 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it gives an opportunity to, as we kind of put things back together again, like we have to rebuild things in a different way, to make it a way that's more inclusive for everyone.
You mentioned that you did a lot of case studies around companies that are really successfully taking on board new ideas and doing innovative work. What have you found as being any prerequisites around being innovative in companies? Do you have to have completely diverse teams, or is there still space in the world for a team of all white male PhDs in biochemistry who are top of their field and therefore can do innovative work?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any prerequisite. There's no this has to be in place. I think, probably smart people who see a problem and a better way of doing things can come up with some innovative product. I think it's going to be more effective in the long term if you have that different perspective brought in. That's what research shows, that diversity and inclusion pay off, but particularly for companies that value innovation. And I noticed with some of the companies that weren't diverse, but they were still innovative, even a company like PayPal, if you look at them over time, they had a shock to the system that caused them to lean into diversity or work to create a more diverse and inclusive environment, or they had a shock that they didn't recover from. And so some of the companies that I profiled are not positive examples of diversity and inclusion, and often their story ends with there is something that happened that they had difficulty recovering from because they didn't have the bench strength to deal with changes or disruptors in their field. And so they sort of, they had problems, and maybe that will be remedied over time. But the companies that started with the diversity or like gathered diversity over time or saw some kind of state shift, then are better able to deal with these like just radical disruptors or changes that we're seeing. Like this is, I don't know, change and disruption is just like the norm, so much so that I hear people are like, don't even use that word anymore. It's so annoying because we talk about it all the time.
Absolutely. I've had a couple of guests on recently talking about their views on diversity and inclusion, equity, and how it all relates to innovation. And one theme that seems to be coming up is just bringing in more demographic diversity doesn't automatically fix some of the underlying cultural issues that have led to issues with inclusion. What's your view on this? What's the sort of research that you've seen, or how do you think that is affecting companies?
No, I mean, that's so true. Most companies at this point, they have diversity, right? Like it's the reality. And that's really what started me on the path to writing Inclusify. Is I probably around 2016, we started to see a lot more diversity in companies, and not all of them made effective use of that diversity. Some of them might have had, we increased diversity, we have higher turnover, we have more conflict, we have like all these bad things, or just like it didn't change anything. And then there's other companies that did the same thing and didn't have those problems. And the difference was really the inclusion factor of when you're bringing in people with different perspectives, those people actually have to feel safe to share their different perspectives, right? They have to feel valued and like they can contribute, or they're going to want to leave and go somewhere else where they can. And so that's why inclusion is really the key. That's why you need the diversity. Is kind of like an interaction. Diversity plus inclusion has the potential to create innovation. Diversity without inclusion, I think, is just the same as, or pretty similar to not having diversity. Maybe you're doing more for social justice, or it's like better than not having diversity. But to get the added benefit from diversity, you need to be inclusive so that all voices can be heard.
So let's talk about how companies can do this. I think we all agree that it's important. And let's say there's a company that realizes they're not doing enough. How can you create this cultural shift to actually improve an environment of inclusivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a hard question because there's not like a how-to, but I would say that companies that do it well, the thing that I have in common is that they didn't just say, okay, now we're going to be inclusive, but they really started with the why. Why is this so important to us? And tied it to the core values of the organization, or made it part of the fabric or the DNA of the organization, to help people understand like, this is happening, like we're doing this. So, tying it to the core values and then operationalizing it. So what does that mean so that people can get their head around it? Like someone told me, just be more inclusive in the way you do things. I don't really know what that means, right? Like I might look up optimal distinctiveness theory, but still I'm left with like, how do I do that? So you have to then give people the tools to make it happen and hopefully hold them accountable in some way. And so a lot of the companies that are doing this well are also tying things like executive bonuses to success around human capital metrics, ensuring, giving people inclusive leadership items on their performance evaluations in 360 so they get feedback as to whether they're being inclusive, because just as much as we want to be inclusive, we don't always know when we're not inclusive. Like I certainly, in Inclusify, include stories of leaders who they find inclusion really important, and they truly believe in their best intentions that they're doing a great job at it. And then their team members are like, oh no, they're not doing a great job. So people need to know, right? It's only for their benefit to give them feedback on it. And then giving them support to, well, what does it mean to do things differently? What is not inclusive about how I'm doing things now, and how can I do it better?
Have you got any examples of I always love examples of where people think they're doing something well, but they might have the Dunning-Kruger effect and not realize that they're actually not doing it that well. So have you got any, as you said, case studies or examples where there was room for improvement in performance by some leadership member?
Yeah, so I have these, quadrants of leaders that were commonly thought they were doing it well, but weren't doing it now. And so one is the meritocracy manager. And those are leaders that aren't really doing much for uniqueness or belonging. They're just like, I am super inclusive. I treat everyone the same. I don't see race or gender. It's just the best person wins. And so do their team members feel included? No, they don't, because there's no esprit de corps. Oftentimes those teams are like the team members are trying to beat each other out to perform better than the person next to them, which doesn't, a little healthy competition is good, but like you also want to feel like you're in a team, you're part of something. There are leaders who were really, I call them culture crusaders, but they thought they were doing a great job at inclusion because they were really focusing on belonging. And so everyone wears the same t-shirt, or we go out for drinks every day after work. Like we're super inclusive, but they weren't, because maybe they lacked diversity on their team, or people who were different on the team. Because this is great. Like we know that companies hire on culture fit. And so people fake their culture to get hired. And then they get there and they're like not happy. So there's always people on your team who appear to fit the culture, but aren't really, but would never speak up about it because they understand that culture fit's important. And so those folks don't necessarily feel included because they're having to fake who they are to be accepted. And you're missing out on those different perspectives, right? And then probably the most interesting or unexpected, the stories of my favorite actually people in the book were like diversity champions, like white knights. They were there, they really were committed to doing something good and, supporting women or people of color, but maybe they just didn't do it in the right way. Like they might have ostracized other majority group members in the organization. You all are sexist, you need to support women, they're trying to do a good thing and champion women, but instead they're just making other people feel left out or not great. And they're not really supporting the women because they're losing their own human capital by like ostracizing these other folks. And then when they say, oh, you should hire Stefanie, people are like, yeah, we know it's just because this person's on a rampage to like try and promote women rather than focusing on the person they're trying to promote's competence.
Absolutely. I think we've all worked in organizations where someone may have had good intentions, but they didn't have the schools or the tools to understand the impact that they were actually having. And impact and especially change moments are probably when the friction can be the highest, especially when a team realizes that something needs to change, but isn't used to things changing. That's when psychological safety is probably the most important. How do you think teams can transition from the old world where maybe diversity and inclusion weren't as strong and go through this rough period to a situation where it's normal and it's accepted, but especially this turbulent middle period?
Yeah. So that's why, I think this is the ideal time to make a change, because no matter if you wanted to leave everything the same, we're all in the turbulent middle period right now. This is the turbulent middle period because of the pandemic that, we're transitioning back to the office. Is it 2 days? Is it 5 days? Is it 0 days? How are our hiring programs going to look? Because I interviewed folks for a job this week and it was all virtual, right? We didn't bring them into the office to do it. And they don't have to be local. Before, if we didn't have funds to fly people out, maybe you just try to recruit locally. It's all different anyway. And so this is a great time to really do it. I don't think that it would disrupt things any more than everything is disrupted now. And these kind of conversations where leaders can focus on getting to know people, building empathy, understanding difference. We need to be having those conversations anyway, because we need to understand, as we're going through this turbulent time around COVID, what is it that you need? What is it that we want? Like, what are things from this remote work period? For those, not everyone's worked remotely, right? Essential workers have been in person, but if you happen to be remote, what are those things do we want to take back to the future of work? And what things do we want to be different? Maybe people's career aspirations have changed. What people thought they wanted and what they valued, I think it's different. So we're going to be doing this anyway. It's just like, while you're doing it, do you choose to do it with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens on what you're doing? And think about those issues as we're like, how do we plan the return to work? Can be, how do we plan to return to work? Or how do we plan to return to work in a way that doesn't disadvantage certain members of our team?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Dr. Johnson, it's been wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out more about your work, your insights, your books, etc., what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Yes, I have a webpage at inclusifybook.com or inclusify.com. And on social media, it's at Inclusify or my name at Dr. Steph Johnson. And I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all the pages. And they can get Inclusify on any bookstore, or take the quiz that I mentioned that tells you kind of where your strengths are at inclusifyer.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. Dr. Johnson, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks, you as well. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they're backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.